back with the final section of this segment, which is the recommendations for eliminating the or reducing the effects of the hubris syndrome, and how the world can be made turn into a more peaceful place for incentivizing peace. The last suggestion that I am making more as a conclusion of this discussion is a reform of the United Nations. The United Nations was basically a military pact in World War II. The United States, France, England, Russia, and China, who were fighting the Axis powers of Nazi Germany, Japan, and fascist Mussolini in Italy. And of course, we know what happened at the end of the war, that the winning parties had the wisdom, at least temporarily, and we hope for that to be more long-term. They had the wisdom to create an institution that would serve the world community and that will change our focus from war to peace. At the time, there probably was not a real concern that Dwight Eisenhower later mentioned as the industrial military complex. That came in the 60s, but we are talking about the mid-40s, or rather the last days of World War II. For whatever reason, the reality of the time demanded that the powers that won the war would undertake the responsibility of redirecting the world attention to a more peaceful engagement in politics. So when the Charter of the United Nations was signed, the structure, the institutional structure of this world body contained a General Assembly. And the General Assembly was to have a representative from every member country. At the time, they were 50, 60, or just a limited number, since a lot of the countries in Africa were still colonies. And many countries in the rest of the world were still struggling with either remnants of colonial power struggles, clashes, and campaigns, ideological and otherwise. But today, the General Assembly has a membership close to 200. Not exactly 200, but pretty close to it. The General Assembly, as the name implies, is the assembly of the world community. One representative from every country around the world, regardless of their power, their size, their population, or seniority, or any other matter for that matter. And that sounds fair. Then, of course, there is the Security Council. And the Security Council consists of those original parties that won the war in Europe: United States, France, England, the Soviet Union, and China. And they acted more as the guardians of this world body, as the nursing mothers of this peace movement, of this peace institution. And whether it was justified or not, they give themselves veto power, which doesn't seem fair, but in terms of the circumstance of the time, perhaps it was justifiable at some level. They also give themselves permanent membership, which would receive the same criticism, at least from me, which is, why would they be permanent? But more than that, I think in the long term, whatever was considered justifiable under the circumstance, whatever was considered understandable then, is not understandable now, and it's not justifiable now. And let me share some reasons with you here. First, in terms of the actual membership, China was one of the members, but the China that was represented in the Security Council was the government of China that was gradually losing power in mainland China, and were eventually pushed out and ended up establishing a government under the Kuomintang, Chiang Kai-shek's government in Taiwan, in Formosa, or the Republic of China. And the population of the Republic of China would have been about 20-25 million the most at the time. They had one of the 5 seats. 20 million people, Taiwanese, had the power of the 1/5 of the world population. The other countries were England and France, that are the size of a rather average country around the world, nothing special about it. And here, of course, by now you must have figured that I'm talking about representing the world population. The Soviet Union, yes, it was a big union, a big power, but is no longer there. And for some reason, that power has been then relegated to Russia, not only being a permanent member, but it seems like there is a hereditary aspect to it. So in terms of China, when the power shifted, the People's Republic of China, the Communist China in the north, was eventually in a position to take over the seat in the Security Council that was China's in World War II. And of course, Taiwan was pushed out of the equation. The Soviet Union was pushed out of the equation, and that power was given to Russia. And France and England keeps their power, and then of course the other power is the United States. So the question of the permanence of them being permanent member is one element that I don't feel comfortable with, and I'm sure a lot of people around the world feel the same, especially in times of critical conflicts, because a simple veto of one or another country could be detrimental to the future of a whole nation. We just heard, I think, 5 niet from the Soviet representative that resulted in the creation of the state of Bangladesh and the division of Pakistan. Political decision, ideological decision that was critical, and it determined the future of 2 nations, in essence 3, India included. And such has been the case in many other situations where very critical resolutions of the world body are vetoed by one or another of these powers. And yes, in the Security Council, they do have other members, rotating members. They do not really have much power. It's symbolic, but I think the function they have is that in a way it gives an air of a more democratically distributed power at the Security Council. But if they don't have permanent membership, and if they don't have veto power, then those who sit around the table in the Security Council are not equal by design. And if they are not equal by design, whatever decision that takes place there is a formality that makes unfairness look fair, and that's not fair. So the Security Council, that's the other body. Of course, the United Nations had other subdivisions or smaller organizations that were engaged in things like UNESCO, the UNICEF, the FAO, and so on and so forth, that have a footprint of sorts around the world. But the important one was the peacekeeping forces under the United Nations. Again, these should have been ones who could have maintained peace. But we saw that in critical situations, the United Nations peace forces were no more than a paper tiger. We saw them how even the Prime Minister of Bosnia Herzegovina, if I recollect the incident correctly, was dragged out of his car and killed by the Serbs right under the eye of the United Nations. The United Nations forces were pushed out by the Israelis during the Lebanon invasion, and the idea was that these forces were there to maintain peace. We have had other instances that were not too different. In other words, the existing structure still allows for bullies to bully the United Nations peacekeeping forces. Of course, there is the stigma of the United Nations forces themselves being involved in rape and other crimes against humanity in and around the Central African Republic in recent times. But that is not a structural defect. The other ones are structural defects. So my suggestion, and I'm sure nobody's going to listen to it, and nobody is going to care what I say, but just to, share it with you for inspiration, if nothing else, is that there has to be a reorganization of the United Nations, and this reorganization has to be representative at equal footing, no privileges, regardless of the fact that, yes, these 4 permanent members were responsible for initiating the United Nations as an institution, but that privilege must expire at some point. Because if it doesn't, if these privileges do not expire, then not only would the bullying continue, but also many of the United Nations General Assembly resolutions are simply ignored because they are being vetoed. And therefore it makes a mockery of that world body. So, number one, that the Security Council, if there is still need for it, it should be broadened to include more than just 10-15 members, and it should be equalized, and it should be made rotational. My suggestion is that they should be representatives of regional units, so that the Security Council should have, say, a regional representative from South Asia, say Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and so on. There's a huge population there. They should have a regional representative of the Middle East, a regional representative of Europe, a regional representative of North America, including Central, and a regional representative of Latin America, for example, and of Central and South Africa, and one for North Africa, and so on. I'm just throwing names of regions. These would have to be adjusted to be more representative of a certain ratio of balance in terms of regional population. One, for instance, for the Far East, Oceania, and maybe, of course, one for China, and so on. So if there is need for the Security Council, it should be more representative and proportionate to the population of the regions of the world, not necessarily particular countries. And these representatives could work as a team. So a team of, say, Latin American diplomats could work together and will have one single vote at the United Nations Security Council. We could also have, and of course we will have to eliminate all the elements of a permanent membership as well as that of the veto. The other reorganization will have to be in terms of the General Assembly. And again, at some level I think that works, but at other level it may not appear fair, as, say, a country like Marshall Islands and China would have the same amount of representation when you consider the difference in their population, that one probably has 1 or 2 million people the most, and the other has more than 1 billion. And of course, when it comes to that, countries like, when it comes to the element of population, countries like India or Brazil are totally underrepresented in this. So again, the reorganization of the General Assembly with perhaps that proportionality of the population might be accommodated in the Security Council. So if we use the American political model, that the Security Council could become more or less like the US Senate, or vice versa, and that the General Assembly could be the Congress. So in some ways, so that we could have a bicameral system for the United Nations, one that have equal representations for different states, another that will have a proportionate representation based on population and perhaps for regions of the world. Then I think if we could dream like this, and at this point it really seems so, we may be able to kind of update ourselves since during the post-war World War II era, and we could probably create institutions that can serve peace at the world level. And as I mentioned, the ones for the United States are even more specific. So let me wrap up this discussion that now we talked about how the the hubris syndrome in governance could work, the United States could take a first step, not just because we are a superpower, but because our influence matters around the world, and that we have plenty of experience in democracy. And I'm not talking about the ones that we are exporting under, or rather the militarism we are exporting in the name of democracy, but rather the very experience of democratic governance since the end of the 18th century, if not earlier. So that the main focus is to reorient the world from overproducing weapons for death and demise and destruction to one of peace. So our economies, our inventions, our creation and production is oriented towards peace and prosperity for humanity, to get rid of hunger and starvation and to eliminate refugees, because that too, even the refugees are the products of war. We talked about it earlier, that there are 65 million people around the world that have become refugees, and the primary cause is war. And in the war, it's the war machine, and that is working hand in glove with the government systems. And that one of the ways to do this is to eliminate the hubris syndrome and rework the intricacies of the Constitution in the United States and perhaps in other countries too, so that incumbency can be harnessed, so that term limits may become, or the negative effects of term limits may be eliminated, and that the addiction to power could end, and that we could have a truly democratic systems by having leaders who come to power, serve the people, leave the office, and leave us alone for a change. Then we could also work towards eliminating militarism at the global level, at the interstate level, and by state I mean world nation states, and to reduce their effect on the militarization of the police. The police has to turn into more, to really take the task of being the police of the civil society, demilitarized, which again, in that respect, I'm advocating a complete ban on any and all forms of weapons. We do not have the right to be born with arms, except for the two arms that extend from our shoulders. We don't need to have other arms. Those are not rights guaranteed by the Second Amendment, because that one talks about arms for a standing militia when we did not have the military. But for a superpower with so much power that our military expenses are bigger than the next 25 nations combined, we do not need guns in our society, and that will restore our democracy. And I hope that with this conclusion, I've been able to share with you certain fundamentals of what is wrong with the world and how can we make it a better place. If anyone looks for a formula, I have it. I don't have the means of implementing them, but I'm sharing the theory, and I hope that someday this becomes a reality so we can take peace advocacy to a higher level. May peace be with you all. Have a nice day.